Today's topic is how to engage effectively with and support new political leadership. This is the sixth and last in a webinar series that we produced with the support of our Distinguished Executives Advisory Network, otherwise known as the Dean's List, a group of very talented, accomplished, experienced executives who have brought their knowledge and views to bear on this project this year. And that's been extraordinarily helpful. Next slide, please. So today, the panelists that are with us are Dan Blair, who is President and CEO of the National Academy for Public Administration, Stan Myberg, Acting Deputy Administrator, the Environmental Protection Agency, Carl Schneider, Deputy Chief Management Officer at the Army, Richard Turman, Deputy Director, Center for Tobacco Products at FDA, and Rita Wells, former Deputy Assistant Secretary for Business Administration, the Department of Energy. And we will be hearing from them as we move into the content of the webinar today. Next slide, please. Before I go much further, let me mention two things. First, that as we have with all of the webinars, we are recording this one so that those who miss anything or would like to share this will be able to access both the audio and the PowerPoint slides on SEA's website. Secondly, if you have questions, we ask that you type them in, and they will be read and raised during the webinar. We have found that that works better than raising your virtual hand for reasons of audio. So that's how we will handle that. So please do feel free to raise any question or make any comment along the way, and we will pay attention to that. So as I indicated, this is the sixth and last in our series of webinars, which began in May. And the reason that we undertook this project was that as we looked around town, obviously there were an awful lot of groups, individuals focused on the upcoming presidential transition. But a great deal of the focus, and the primary focus, was on the incoming administration and political appointees, whether with regard to policy or management issues and the transitioning of folks into their political positions. And at the same time, we knew that an awful lot of career senior executives have come in to the SES and senior professional positions over the last 8 years, and therefore a good number have not gone through a transition at the SES level, and that it would be valuable to produce a series of webinars and ultimately a handbook, which we did do, that would walk them through the process. So during the year, we have dealt with what to expect during the year, the role of the SES in transition, what executives could do and should have begun doing earlier in the year. We reviewed the agency work, namely the transition councils, and what the White House Transition Coordinating Council, the Agency Transition Directors Council, was doing, and what to expect from transition teams in the next administration. And finally, the last webinar we did was a review of the SES personnel rules that are of particular concern during transition, including the different 120-day get-acquainted periods. And we will make some reference to that later in this webinar. So that brought us to today and how to engage effectively with and support new political leadership after arrival. So if we go to the next slide, As I indicated earlier, the recordings and slides are all on SEA's website, along with a list of key references and resources. But, excuse me, most importantly, we were able to produce, as a result of these webinars and other material that we had available, primarily from work we've done over the years with distinguished executives, the Presidential Transition Handbook for Career Executives, and it is currently in version 3.0. It's available on our website, and I know that I've gotten feedback from a number of people who have indicated that they found it very valuable and it's in use in their agencies. So for those of you who are on the webinar who have not yet taken a look at that, I urge you to do that. And we've also more recently released a handbook for political appointees with advice on the SES, namely what the SES is and what the personnel system is and how to best relate to and develop successful relationships with career executives. Next slide. So now we'll move into the content. And we begin with a quote that came from one of our distinguished executives at a morning of reflections following one of our Presidential Distinguished Rank Award banquets. Every transition eventually becomes a transformation. It moves from initial distrust from the political appointee to his or her eventually saying, civil servants are great, their contributions invaluable, and I didn't realize it when I walked in. So the challenge is obviously to minimize the time it takes for that transformation to take place and for the career political team to function well. Obviously, there are two sides to that team, and the side we're focusing on today is the career executive side and what you all can do to make this transition, your relationship with new political leadership work really well. So the first thing we're going to address in the next slide is the characteristics of new appointees. And there are 2 or 3 points we want to make here. First, that there is not one size fits all. Obviously, appointees come in with different backgrounds, different preparation. Obviously, some may have been in government previously, some may never have served in government, some from the private sector, some from the nonprofit sector. Different needs, coming in with different points of view about what they want to accomplish, and particularly their motivation, their expectations, and obviously very differing knowledge of their roles. Some who have served previously will have a much better sense than others, clearly. But many are often new to large, complex organizations, to successful government management, which does differ from private sector management, new certainly to the notion of the dispersion of power, and to an invasive, what can often be an invasive congressional presence, as well as media scrutiny, which as well can be invasive at times. Finally, they're challenged by a backlog of decision and what can be a government of strangers, and that is to say, not only are they meeting the staff that's going to work for them, the career folks, but also many of them don't know each other. So I want to stop here and ask Dan Blair to start and make some observations on this. Dan comes obviously with a very rich background from the Postal Regulatory Commission, from having served as Deputy Director of OPM, Senior Counsel on the Senate Committee on Governmental Affairs, and a staff director's position on the House side. So Dan, I think would like to hear your views on characteristics of new appointees and what would be of particular importance to understand about them.
Well, Carol, thank you. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here today and discuss this upcoming transition. I'm commenting on this from a perspective of not being part of the transition team. I'm commenting on it from a good government perspective. I know many of the landing team folks and folks who will be going into the administration. And it's my sense that several key points I think to keep in mind. One, I have told people that what was said on the campaign trail is not necessarily going to dictate how this new administration will govern. I think we've seen this so far in the transition, and I think that you will continue to see that. I think one overwhelming characteristic of this new administration will be how to make government run more like a business. Now, we've heard this for years, and we often understand that it means different things to different people. But from my interactions thus far with the transition teams and senior members of the transition team, I get a very strong sense that the president-elect wishes to bring in more and better business practices to government. And that can be a challenge. I don't get a sense that there's a natural hostility to those who are currently in government, but I think as with every transition, there is, as you said, Carol, in your opening, that there is an initial distrust and suspicion. I remember being told from some of my contacts at the Office of Personnel Management that the career executives that were brought in during the George W. Bush administration, and I think probably by the time that we got to 2009, that probably would have been about 80% of them, were viewed, quote unquote, as tainted. So if that was the initial view of the Obama folks, I think it's instructive to think about what will the next administration be thinking about their senior executives on whom they're going to have to rely. I think one of the most important things is that they will come to understand that the careerists are the most valuable asset that they have. And coming to that realization is going to take an understanding that the careerists are there to make them successful. So that's kind of a two-way street. And rules are in place. I think that you can't bring all private sector folks in. I think you'll see folks from the Hill. You'll see folks from past Republican administrations come in. You may even see some folks from the Obama and or Clinton administrations coming in based upon the conversations you've seen taking place at Trump Tower. But I think that the idea that the career civil servants, particularly the career SES, are their most valuable asset, and a realization that the career SES are there to make them successful. So I think those are some of the 2 points that I would bring out in this discussion today. I thought that was interesting what you said, Carol, that this is a government of strangers, and it is going to be a government of strangers. But there's going to be a bonding experience that goes on. There'll be training that goes on. And I think that you'll see a camaraderie develop among the political class. And I think that the key role here is to make sure that the career folks understand that that's not necessarily an us versus them, but that will be a natural occurrence that takes place. And the challenge will be to make those appointees understand that you are there to carry out the president's new agenda and to make them successful. That's kind of my input from the beginning.
You know, the point about a government of strangers was made by Shelley Metzenbaum, who had been at both, Stan knows, at EPA as well as OMB. And certainly initially her point was, bear in mind that they don't all know each other. Obviously they will get to know each other and develop that camaraderie, but they're kind of in that, in a boat that we don't often think about that way. Stan, I'm going to turn to you because you served in, go ahead.
Carol, I was just going to make one other point when you mentioned that.
Sure.
I think one of the worst things that can be done is to presume that the appointee is going to fit into this specific box or square. And I think that that's where it's going to take judgment and watching and expertise. But moreover, I think the worst thing that can be done is to back these new appointees into a corner and make decisions for them that they would feel should have been made by them. So I think to give the new appointees the sense of control is important. It's important to give them the sense that career executives are their key resource.
Indeed. It's going to turn to Stan, who is one of our, as all of our panelists are today, the exception of Dan, because I don't think, Dan, you never served in a career position in the executive branch. So you weren't eligible to be a distinguished executive. But Stan, you've served in both, obviously, long-term career executive, but you've also served in acting political positions. So I'd like to get your take on characteristics of new appointees, and I'm sure you've seen them in every stripe.
Well, Carol, I thank you very much, and that was a generous way for Carol to say that I've been around for 39 years, so I'm an old-timer. But a couple of observations I want to make, and one is stolen from Linda Fisher, who was a deputy administrator at EPA and had several other positions. And we had Linda and some other former appointees come in to speak to our senior executives back in the summer, and one of the points she made is that political appointees are people too. And it's useful to start out with that perspective. As you pointed out, Carol, people come in with a variety of backgrounds and experiences, and one of the opportunities for career executives is to realize that this gives you the opportunity to learn from them, because they will have a different lens on things that you may have been doing inside, and that can be very illuminating and a great opportunity. At the same time, there's going to be a lot of learning going on all around in the first 6 months especially, that it's very common for agencies to get, for example, in my case, an administrator relatively early, but the second tier of political appointees takes longer to move through the process. And it can be a very lonely experience for the political appointee who comes in first, just trying to figure out what's going on, who can you trust, how do you get things done, where are the buttons that you push in order to accomplish things that you want to do. And if people recognize, and sort of to Dan's point, that there's some value in not looking too far in front of your headlights on those things, but to listen, to learn, to find ways to be helpful, just to make that transition they are experiencing a little easier. I mean, that's a great thing for the country because it will make the government function better. And so the more you can do that and be responsive and listen, it's really helpful. On the point about a government of strangers, it's strangers with each other, the new political team, as well as strangers to the agency in which they work. And one of the things that I think this administration really made a point of was that and was illuminating to me when I came into this job, was the emphasis on the Executive Management Council at the senior departmental level. This administration was serious about that. They convene us every month. They would have good agendas on issues that cut across the entire government. But for somebody coming in new, it was wonderful to have that other group of peers you could talk to about things that were of common concern, and the SES executive order being one obvious example. So I think that new appointees are going to have two different ways they will have to look at the world. One is obviously their own agency responsibilities, but the more they can function on issues that cut across government, and if the administration makes that a priority, that the nation would be well served. But it is going to be tough for somebody coming in new, because you'll have to do both those things at the same time, and especially if leadership at the agency comes in without a lot of experience in the past work of the organization. That, Yeah, I look at the last 3 administrators of EPA, just to pick on that example. All 3 of them had had prior experience with EPA in some way, shape, or form. That, I think, gave them a leg up in just having a sense of how the agency worked when they became the administrator. If you have an administrator who has not had that prior experience, it's harder. So I just offer that as an observation. So you have to make adjust some of your styles to the kind of person that a new political appointee is.
Okay, I'm going to, before I ask Richard, Rita, and Carl to weigh in, I'm just going to go to the next slide because I think it adds another dimension, and that is the differences in approach, skills, and competencies. If we contrast careers with appointees, obviously you all who have served in government have a very solid and deep understanding of government processes, as well as a deep subject matter expertise and functional expertise that relates to your agency and very often to cross-agency issues. You have a strong historical perspective, which you can bring to bear, and the stress is on continuity, on the long term. Appointees often come in with shorter-term goals. They have a limited amount of time to get things done, and that leads to the urgency. Translate that agenda into action. And early on, it may not be unusual to move abruptly from one goal or one crisis, as it may be, to another. So I just wanted to add that context to this and then see who would like to weigh in first. Why don't we start with Carl Schneider at Army.
Okay, thanks, Carol. And I think that's a great segue into a couple of points I wanted to make. You know, first of all, and I think it's alluded to both by Dan and by Stan, is the issue of trust. We have to get the trust of the people when they come in the door. And I think the best way to do that, number one, is to act as the professionals that we are. Our job is to give them our best professional advice and to help them take action within the law. And as we can show them that we are professionals, then I think the trust is built. In addition to the professionalism, there's also the issue of competence, that we actually do know a lot about very important substantive matters, and that we can help them with that. And finally, as to trust, I think the issue of listening that Stan, I think you just made, and even asking them, what do you want to get accomplished? What are your priorities? What do you want to do in the next 6 months? What do you want to do in the next year? I know when I had a new assistant secretary come in the last time, that was the question I asked her when we sat down for the first time. I said, so what are your priorities, so that I can talk to the rest of the office about how their work is going to fall in on your priorities. The second thing I think is important is senior executives to be exemplars, to model what a professional is. I think it's very important for us to set an example for our subordinates, because they're looking at us. They're going to look at us and say, well, how is Carl going to react to this political? And they're going to model their behavior upon our behavior. So if we come across as professionals, then I think people will look at us, and the transition for our subordinates is going to be much easier if we can help lead the way on that. And finally, on the example part is, you know, think of yourself as an example. Think of yourself of how you're presenting yourself to the principal. And if you were a political appointee, what would you want your senior executives to do for you? Also, make sure you're taking care of yourself. I think there's a lot of stress and strain that goes on during the transition times, and I think it's always important for us to take care of ourselves. Finally, I'd say don't waste a crisis. You know, when you have a change like this, especially as big a change as I think is coming, there are going to be opportunities. There are going to be opportunities for us to show them, you know, we've been doing a lot of really good government stuff. We're working on auditability. We're working on personnel reform. We're working on all kinds of things to maybe find ways to learn from business already. And if we can talk to them in the language that maybe they understand, they're going to say, oh yeah, so you guys really are thinking about it and working on this stuff. So I think stressing good government things and having some sort of plan, and I think Stan's point is don't get too far out in front, but have a general approach to it that you can adjust as you learn more from the political appointees as to what they want to do. But at the end of the day, it's about professionalism, it's about character, competence, and commitment. If we act as professionals, we'll be seen as professionals, and we'll get the trust that we need to do the important work of government. That's all I have.
Okay, I'm going to turn to Rita and then to Richard, and if you have any anecdotes that you can share about your experiences with transition, dealing with new political appointees and the differences in approach, that would be great. But in any event, Rita, why don't you take the next spot?
Okay, I'd be glad to, Carol. I think it's really important to realize that there are many political appointees at all different levels, and there are people who will be coming into your organizations right now who you may not expect to be there long term, but in fact they may be. And even if they do not stay long term, they very likely will be reporting back to the people who will be there longer, what they have seen in the early days. And I recall one transition where very young people came in, very friendly, very outgoing, kind of hanging out with some of the junior staff, and kept saying that they were just in there for the prep work. They stayed almost the entire 4 years of that administration. And the staff, I think, sort of let down their guard, especially the younger ones. And from that, what I learned is to make sure that your staff, who will have any contact with any of the people who show up from the new administration, be sure to treat them with professionalism and respect and discretion. You really don't want jokes and gossip and that sort of thing to be transferred. And I really like the comment that was made about the importance of a senior executive setting the example for your staff. And it doesn't have to be heavy-handed, but I think you need to remind folks before the new team comes in to be discreet and to be professional. The other thing is, I think it's really important to learn as much as you can about the appointees in leadership positions, especially those you're going to be reporting directly to. And I have reported to people who had a wealth of experience in large government organizations. I've reported to entrepreneurs who supervised only an assistant and came into a very large organization with many complex pieces. So it's important. I can remember one incident where one of the appointees was just a brilliant scientist who was used to doing hands-on work in his own lab. And he thought that the organization he was coming into included people working in labs, and was just shocked to find out that the people in the organization were not in labs. They were sitting at desks and they were following bureaucratic procedures to award grants and cooperative agreements. And I mean, that sounds like kind of a unique experience, but I think that in many cases, the people who are coming in as part of the new administration may not really understand what occurs on a daily basis in the organizations that they're going to lead. And I think it's important to try and assess that early, to help them. In our organizations, we provide a tremendous amount of data. Sometimes it's very much data overload for the new appointees. I think we have to, as Stan said, remember that they are people too. And if we recall what it was like ourselves going into new jobs in new organizations, you know, you're excited, you're kind of apprehensive, maybe a little confusing at first, and And if you think back to your own experiences in new jobs, in new organizations, and then add to that what the new administration is also experiencing, short-term and in many cases no experience with government management, often just absolutely amazed and overwhelmed by roles related to human resources, to contracting, to budget, as was mentioned, the interaction not only with the Hill but with media, with inspector generals who are coming, with auditors, with reports. I often felt like I was an interpreter for the appointees that I was reporting to. And I think that's important. Just at a very basic human level, people need somebody who can be there to help them and understand in plain English what's going on and what's being communicated.
That's a wonderful description, Rita, interpreter. So let's see, Richard, what you would, what particularly resonates with you here.
I wanted to associate myself with the remarks by my colleagues on the panel because they're all been good pearls of wisdom and reflected many of the experiences I've had as an SES at OMB, at NIH, at the HHS Secretary's Office, and now at the Food and Drug Administration. But two things on this slide I just wanted to make slight tweaks to that I think is worth thinking about as well. It's been noted that a lot of the people coming in actually have some detailed experience, and they often have, in the case of my experience, when I've dealt with people coming in through administrations back to Mr. Reagan, very functional and deep subject matter expertise that actually the folks at careerists don't necessarily have in that subject matter sometimes. And that's worth being mindful of, that you may not be aware that, 3 jobs back they actually had that detail. And it's important to be, respectful of the possibility that they actually have that deep expertise and knowledge, and make sure to include that and recognize that while we've been in federal service or out and in and out, some of us, that we don't necessarily have all of those pieces and answers, and they often have some detailed experience. The other type they have is being in a regulated industry or in a state that has either not gotten money or some other thing. And I think that those perspectives they have are worth us reminding ourselves that they actually do also have some deep subject matter expertise, which is why they're an appointee. The other point I was going to make is that the careerists can also, I think, we are a reservoir of knowledge about what the authorities of our programs are, both the opportunities that those authorities provide and limitations. And that's an area of a kind of a bullet I would think of to at least call out, because it's an area where we can provide those new folks with, well, they come in and say, well, we don't want to do it this way. And you say, well, okay, here's the other ways that we can do it within our authorities. You are that repository of knowledge, and the party who can give the, well, we tried it this way before, or other parties tried and we found we couldn't, but it depends on the legal perspective. And I think that's a really important area where often, if they're coming from, especially not in a government environment, they don't necessarily understand the importance of looking back at the statute and being real clear what you can and can't do. And what we can provide is that set of translations and interpretive functions, working with our general counsels, to be able to provide that for them, which is an area I think that careerists have something to offer to help folks trying to struggle through, okay, what can I do? And I think that's an area where we need to remind ourselves that we actually can step back and ask, what are those authorities and how could they do that? Those are the only two things I'd add to this slide.
Richard, this is Stan. I would jump in on that from the standpoint of the legal authorities, because in EPA, we probably have as prescriptive a set of statutes as any agency in the government, with the possible exception of IRS, but I'm not sure about that either. And yet, even for as prescriptive as our authorities are, there are many cases where there are choices to be made about the application of those authorities, and they involve policy choices. That I've found that for people, even when you've had cases where you think that the law is clear, and you'll say, oh, you can't do that, it's against the law, is usually not the best approach to take. But rather simply to say, here are the precedents for taking these things. In this particular case, the court case went this way, it was decided this way, but there is a risk judgment to make about pursuing particular courses of action. And the best legal counsel in EPA always presents, here are the options you have, and here are the legal risks by going that particular way. An executive may choose to accept that risk. and ultimately it'll be litigated in the courts and decided that way. But to frame it as, here are the choices, here are the risks.
Excellent. I'm going to move on to the next few slides and review them, and then circle back to you all. I suspect that what we're going to see in these slides is going to reinforce or repeat some of what you said, and there may well be a few new points, but I'm going to start with the really a focus on the role of career executives. And it was suggested that we remind ourselves of the oath that you all took when you entered government service, in which I understand, I think Carl mentioned that at Army, when new folks are move into the senior executive service, they're taking this oath again, are they not, Carl?
Yes, that's right.
Every federal employee is supposed to take this oath.
Yeah, I mean, we try to make it, especially since we have this socialization of military and civilians. We try to really drive home to people that part of being a member of the profession, the public service profession, we'll call it, is you do take an oath. It's more than just a job. You go to work at Google, you don't take an oath. You come to work for the government, you take an oath, and something changes in your relationship, and you become part of this profession. And I just think it's very important that we talk about that and remind ourselves that there is something special about working for the United States government.
I couldn't agree. This is Dan Blair. I couldn't agree with you more. Every federal employee is supposed to take this oath, including the politicals as they come in. So this is an opportunity of a shared experience to highlight in order to start building those relationships. If you have people coming in from outside, from the private sector, this is going to be, not in a negative way, but it's going to be alien to them. And understanding that coming on board that you do have a fiduciary duty to the people of the United States, and that this duty is exemplified through this oath of office. And politicals and careers take it both. And this is part of a shared common experience to build on the relationship as you move forward.
Yeah, and the thing that, this is Carl Schneider again, the thing that is was distressing to us when we first started to look at this is when I came to work in government service, I took my oath in a big room with a bunch of other people, and essentially a personnel clerk came in and gave us the oath. Now what we do in Army is we actually make it a ceremony, and we have a general officer or a senior executive host the ceremony. And it just really drives home the point that you just made, Dan, is that we really are part of something special.
And Carl, this is Stan, just to give you a shout out. I've been to those ceremonies. I went to one recently where General Semonite gave the oath to Karen Baker when she was promoted into the SES. It's quite moving, and we are trying to steal a page from your book.
Good.
That's wonderful. Okay, so as we look at that oath and think about this and think about transition, there were 3 points that we thought worth reminding ourselves of, namely that the role of career executives is to serve every administration to the very best of your ability without regard to personal political beliefs, to provide continuity in leadership and expertise during presidential transitions, and to serve as the interface or link between policy and implementation. I'm going to move on to a number of tips that we have, and starting in the next slide, just really looking further into this role in a little more granular way. And the panelists have already covered some of this, but worth reminding ourselves one more time. So your role is to introduce the appointees to agency staff, to resources and programs, to serve as an institutional memory and training new political leadership, or as Rita put it, to serve as an interpreter. to not act as a roadblock to change, but to provide recommendations and options to accomplish appointee goals. To point out possible political or legal problems when changing a current practice or implementing a new procedure, as Stan indicated, not only going through the various authorities or possibilities, but the risks in each. And certainly helping the personnel you supervise adapt to and implement change. And I think you've each covered these as we've gone through the last half hour or so, but anyone want to weigh in and reinforce any of this? If not, we'll move on to the 15 tips that we have, and then I'm going to ask the panelists to talk about those that really resonate with them. So on the next slide, we begin the 15 tips that came from distinguished executives. First, to learn about the new appointees for and with whom you'll work and the policies and programs they're likely to promote. And that was just mentioned recently. Prepare written briefing materials for the new appointees, including program objectives and priorities for day one and beyond. In the prior webinars we've had, there's been a lot of emphasis on the fact that the day of the 3 or 4 inch thick books are pretty much gone. That certainly a good deal is being provided electronically, but the importance of not overloading new appointees with more than they can ever possibly take a look at or absorb. And one of our webinars, when the panelists made the point that it'd be very valuable to really break some of this material into what do you really need to know on day one versus next month versus 6 months from now. To communicate early and often with new appointees and obtain meetings as soon as you can, and to especially be well prepared for those meetings. You may be well prepared for the ones that you obviously are aware of coming, but a number of executives have pointed out being kind of surprised at being called in to introductory meetings and some of the kinds of questions that that get asked. So whether they are, well, where do you think the agency's at right now? What are the most important things we ought to be doing? Another one is to provide all the options for decisions, including ones that may be anathema. This is not a favorite part of the job, being the bearer of bad tidings, but it is indeed part of the executive's job. Developing relationships with appointees, key advisors, and I think Rita talked about this previously, that very often there are junior advisors or junior political staff as well as senior that some may be inclined to dismiss or not attend to completely, and eventually those juniors become seniors. And so a number of executives have found those to be ultimately very valuable relationships to build. To learn about and adjust to the management style of new appointees, and I think that one is really critical. It does take time to learn the preferences of an appointee, whether they, how they like to be briefed, what kind of meetings they like, what they're really looking for from you. And of course, sometimes the best way to determine that is a few direct questions.
Carol, this is Stan.
Yeah.
Hey, Carol, this is Stan. Let me just do a re-emphasis on your point, and it really can be very simple. That when you're dealing with new employees, just one of the helpful things is up front to ask about what their learning style is. And some people learn better through engagement and dialogue with small groups. Some people are visual learners and they like to see stuff. Just having, the more clarity you can get about that early on, the more likely it is that you can have effective communication, and also asking for any meeting, what is success for this meeting, so you know that going in. Richard, you got a comment too.
I was just going to, I'm recalling at OMB, we had a brand new OMB director came in, and the team prepared all these charts and graphs. I didn't check ahead of time about his learning style, and he was colorblind relative to the actual way. And it was in a decade where people were really excited about the technology.
Right. And they've done that. Yeah. I've done graphs and charts, and I have no idea between the blue and green.
Indeed, and there are ways to think about that on the front end, and then figure out ways to be able to present the information you're so excited about. But they had some whiz-bang technology they wanted to show the director of O&B, and it didn't work out so well. So learning style is really key, and I just wanted to follow on that.
That is a wonderful anecdote. I like that one. All right, the last one on this slide is to keep your focus on the mission and to seize opportunities to influence the agenda with facts and ideas. And we've had a little bit of conversation about that already. Before I move on to the next one, though, anyone else want to comment on any of these that particularly resonate with you? Or if not, we'll move on.
Carol, this is Dan. The one about the written briefing materials for the new appointees is one that kind of causes me pause. You don't want, these folks are going to be, especially if they're from outside of government, will be drinking from the proverbial fire hose. And if you come in from a business background, maybe the last thing that you want to see is a mile-high stack of briefing books. And so I think one of the things is to learn their style before, if there's a way of learning their style before they come in, and whether it be briefing books or wanting to know the 10 hot topics of what have been GAO reports, IG reports, Hill hearings, or things like that. They may not want to go in depth until maybe they may want to go in depth later in their service, but right now they want to get a feel for the four corners of their official duties, and these briefing materials may be overwhelming and will sit and idly by in a corner or a closet. So I think those are some things, the questions to ask. And maybe it's empathy. We always ask that supervisors and executives be empathetic with their employees. In this case, I'd flip it and say, what do you think that if I was coming in fresh and new, what would I want? So I think that maybe those are some things to think about.
I was going to resonate.
Absolutely. In fact, one of prior webinar, there was a strong recommendation to consider one-pagers. And then you go from there when you determine where they really want to dig in. So was that Richard who wanted to weigh in?
Two things. We actually had a recent conversation within HHS on transition with our executives, with some of the folks who come in as politicals in this administration, and what they did or didn't like about the things that they had received. And the one thing they said was, if it's more than 2 pages, you're wasting your time, and we got a lot of 4-inch binders, and you're hurting yourself. So that just goes to that point. Another key point is that item 5 on this list, I can't stress enough, the point that's been made relatively also on this call, is that junior staff can not only become your boss or senior staff, they are also, and it's worthwhile remembering, they can be an effective conduit. If the person you're trying to deal with is the incoming deputy secretary, chief of staff, or secretary, if there's a conduit where you can get the decisions and the timing and the other issues through that person, and it's a trusted conduit, that's actually a helpful way to be able to move the freight, because you can get things done through them. And the other is to the Be Nice rule, which is that all the members of the transition team, which can become the new leadership, what can be perceived as the least titled among them can all of a sudden become, in our case at HHS, 3 months in, the chief of staff of the department. And it is worthwhile noting that the Be Nice rule works in all fora.
Peter, did you have any comment?
Yeah, just to kind of piggyback on that comment about the Be Nice rule. Again, I think it's important to remember that they are people, and they appreciate help even with the smallest things. Letting them know that there is an exit they can go out that's a little closer, but there are only certain hours it's open. I recall some advice that was given to me by a mentor who was a senior exec, and he told me that he worked for a political appointee who came in, and the curtains in his office wouldn't close completely. And so in the afternoon, the sun was just beaming in strongly and giving the guy headaches, and they couldn't get the maintenance crew to come up and fix it. And my mentor told me that as a senior exec, he went in and he fixed the darn curtains. And he said that helped to build such camaraderie, trust, and it showed the appointee that he really took seriously the things that affected the appointee personally. And I think it's important to look for those small things that can be done to help the person who has come into this new political job.
Excellent. Let's go on to the remaining number in the next slide, because I'm going to guess you're going to have some equally good comments on those. So the 8th one was an interesting one that we heard in a prior webinar, which was to make an honest assessment of your own strengths and weaknesses. Things that may have served you well with the prior appointee may not be the things that will serve you well with the next one. And so getting really a good fix on yourself and preparing to resell yourself to the incoming team is important, and you have 120 days to do that. And so towards the end, a few slides down, I'll go back over the 120-day rule with you all. But basically, it's the get acquainted period where, by and large, you do have an opportunity to develop a relationship and make clear to the appointee for whom you're working that you are there to make him or her successful. Number 9, don't cling to old ideas. Be flexible and agile. Accept confusion and uncertainty, as that is almost inevitable, that it's going to take a while for things to settle down. Expect pushback until the new team develops trust in you. And as someone said earlier, you're going to build that trust through displaying competence with integrity, honesty, and facts. And your attitude is critical. Be nice and being positive. Listen carefully, but don't overinterpret the words. There's an interesting conversation about this among distinguished executives at one morning of reflections, where if you would take everything literally, you could create chaos in your agency. There might be some just offhand or thinking out loud comment by an appointee. So you want to listen, you want to be certain you understand their wishes, but don't overinterpret every last thing they say. Be patient, honest, and open, and especially share bad news when necessary. There is some value in being cautious, as Rita pointed out earlier, with regard to comments, and you want to risk, certainly you are going to end up risking a bit, but you also will protect yourself, obviously, by being thoughtful and cautious along the way. And finally, the one that we all know in the end, if you're unable to work well with the new team, you find another job. It was not unusual over all the years I spent at SEA when an executive might get a notice of reassignment and call us and our staff for advice. And very often it was a situation where there really wasn't going to be much value in pushing back on the reassignment, and the advice was to take it and see how things developed, and you're likely to be a happier person. And indeed, it was not unusual to 6 months later find out that in fact it was a good move. They were more effective, more successful, and happier as the net result. So let me stop here and hear which one of these resonates with the panelists, or where they might disagree or have a little additional thought to offer.
Carol, this is Dan. One thing I would point out is I talked about empathy before, realizing that this new appointee that will be coming in as a non-career SES or as a PAS is going to have to managing down, so to speak, of dealing with and managing the career SESers and or the GS staff underneath him or her, they're also going to have to be managing up. And you know what I've found in organizations is that while you might get pelted left and right by things when you're within an organization, if you rise up another level, what you get pelted with is completely different. So you have to kind of understand what will make them successful with his or her next tier of, you know, and that next level of political appointees, whether it be the cabinet, the department head, agency head, or fill in the blank. So I think that that's something to understand, is that they have to manage up. And if you can help them be successful at that, you're going to be successful as well.
This is Stan. I wanted to emphasize sort of your point about accept confusion and uncertainty, because that is the one thing that's pretty much guaranteed. And some have asked me what is helpful, and I said having a high tolerance for ambiguity. That the only, and beyond that, the only certainty you ever are going to have is that something will happen that nobody expects. And to be prepared for that, not in terms of anticipating all possible scenarios, but developing the capabilities so that when different things occur that are a surprise, you kind of know what the capability of you and your organization is, can be very helpful.
This is Richard. I think living with ambiguity is indeed the life we lead. But to the managing upwards point, I wanted to note that one of the things we can really help people do is understand kind of the informal structures within the organization. They've all of a sudden just come in, and they're going to try and figure out, do I need to pay attention to this OMB when OPM calls? What order do I, you know, when the authorizer calls and the appropriator calls? Who do I need to pay attention to, and why on earth do they have two sets of committees? And how do you help them understand where they need to touch base? Within the organization, they've just become a part, and you can have a sense of that. And you can essentially say, look, these are the other part of the political team you're going to need to check with before you go forward to the secretary at OMB or the president. Here's the other parts that we can tell you're going to want to have checked, because they're going to ask you. Because we expect completed staff work. They're not quite sure what it takes to make that happen. And to the degree we can help through the managing up and helping them be successful, knowing who they have to talk to, that will allow them to be successful, to accomplish the goals, make them successful, and indeed the mission of the agency about which we're all about.
This is Rita, and as far as don't cling to old ideas, I have seen policy change 180 with a transition. I mean, absolutely, from fighting something just tooth and nail to becoming the biggest supporter of it. And to Stan's point about being tolerant of ambiguity, just, you know, don't be surprised. It will likely happen with an administration of this nature. And it probably goes without saying, but put away the coffee mugs that have the slogans from the old the lanyard. I mean, get rid of that stuff. You just don't want any of that stuff around your office.
The website.
Yeah, good point.
Making sure it's kept up to date.
But also what branded kind of things it has from the last regime is always worth being mindful of in a world that it wasn't always on the checklist before.
What I think that's absolutely wonderful, Rita. The kind of thing that no one ever thinks about until after someone's walked in to their office, and then they leave and look around and say, "Oh my God." So that's a good one. Who is next?
Yeah, this is Carl. I just wanted to sort of close out the discussion about confusion and uncertainty by pointing out that the radio call sign of the nominee to be Secretary of Defense is chaos. So.
Okay. Well, we're going to move next to Stan Myberg's top 12 tips for transition. I heard Stan's been doing this for a long time, so I think by now he does it pretty well. I remember you're doing this in a session we had of pairs of careerists and political appointees who had worked together, and it was a very interesting session with regard to how did we work out our relationship and get to know each other and be successful together. So look forward to hearing this again, Stan. It's all yours.
Well, Carol, thank you, and I'll give the abbreviated version because much of this has already been covered in the discussion, but the context of this was, as Carol said, a discussion when I was on the career side, and now I find myself sort of on the political side, so it's fascinating. I can have a discussion with myself. But this was from the perspective of what are things are useful, just simple, ordinary, simple tips for people. And one is and it was done as a top 12, or it was going to be top 10, but there were too many. But the number 12 was indeed to present real choices. That there is nothing less satisfying to an appointee than being presented with the three options, or we're going to bomb Moscow, or we're going to surrender to the Russians, or we're going to negotiate a reasonable solution. That's not options. Options are things that involve real choices, each of which will have advantages, opportunities, and which will have risks. And be straight up about that and really think hard about giving people real choices. Folks really appreciate it. The 11th one is don't gossip about appointments. And it's a very human tendency. We all love to do it, but it just is not productive. And usually it is the case that them what knows ain't telling, and them what tells ain't knowing. So it's just sort of kind of a waste of time, and encourage people not to do it. The 10th thing is to remember that you do learn lessons from good bosses and you learn lessons from bad bosses. And if you find yourself in a situation with a boss who really is sort of not your cup of tea, but you are there and you need to be there, think about what lessons you can learn from that experience. Hopefully you like to learn the lessons from the good bosses and apply those in your own life. But you learn from both good and bad bosses. The ninth point was...
Dan, I'm going to interrupt you and just ask if you can share with us a lesson you learned from a bad boss.
Yes, I learned a lesson that people who are insecure have real difficulty, and there's not a whole lot you can do to fix that. And sort of the lesson about what you can't fix. If you have a boss who's really insecure, it can be very hard to work with, but to recognize that that's what it is, and then try as much as you can to be sensitive of that and make sure that the insecure boss is kept fully informed of what you're doing, because it will not be possible to build up a trust relationship where you can go off on your own. A hard lesson, but it's an important one. Sort of part of, and the lesson may be you can't fix it. On the ninth one, we touched on it earlier, and Rita, you gave a perfect, or I can't remember who gave the example about the curtains. Was that yours? That's a perfect example. The example I used is back when Bill Ruckelshaus came back into EPA back in the 1980s. There was an assignment to put together the briefing book, which in those days was going to be the large one, and nobody wanted it. And our division raised its hand and said, we'll do it. And I don't know if Bill Ruckelshaus ever read that book, but we did a good job of putting together a very professional-looking, credible book, and it gave the organization credibility for bigger assignments later. So that you build credibility for big things by doing small things well. The eighth one is, I think, obvious to most people that not all issues, even in this hyper-partisan world that we live in, not all issues are partisan. People have different interests. For example, if you want to use an EPA example and you want to predict where people stand on the renewable fuel standard about the use of ethanol in gasoline, partisanship will not predict your answer to that question. What will predict your answer to that question is whether you're from an agricultural state or an oil state. Number 7 is to distinguish between policy and moral issues, and let me spend just a minute on that. There are many choices that get made in the course of normal work that I would classify as standard policy choices. And it's important to sort of see that for what it is. On the other hand, if you are asked to do something that goes against your own personal code, whether it is because you believe that what you're being asked to do is illegal, or which you believe will in fact be a morally bad choice, I think you have an obligation to speak up about that, and if you cannot do it, to then step aside. but most choices are policy choices where reasonable people can look at the same set of facts and reach different conclusions about an appropriate policy choice. And I think we as civil servants owe it to people to, if it's within that bound of a policy choice, once the arguments are all done and the decision is made, to take that and move forward with it. And again, if you can't do that, then you probably need to be looking for another job. The sixth is I am sort of an inveterate optimist, and I tend to think that the glass is usually half full. Maybe sometimes I'm sure it's not, but often it is, that even in the most difficult situations, there are opportunities. And if you think about or go at things by looking for those opportunities, it makes you both a happier person and it's more satisfying for you in your professional life. But that also reaches the next one, which is don't confuse your job with your life. And all of us, especially in people who are in jobs that are important and make a difference, can fall into this trap. But you are not your job. You are not your job. The job will be there when you have left it. You will be there when you are in a different role. And to sort of try to resist the temptation to identify your own self-worth with what you do. The people who love and care for you don't love and care for you because you are the assistant secretary of XYZ. So sort of to keep that in mind sort of leads to a happier life. Number 4 about Miles' Law is one that students of public administration are very familiar with, and it's a very useful means of explaining certain behavior. Miles' Law is where you stand depends on where you sit. The story for this goes back to the Bureau of the Budget in the 1960s from and you'll appreciate this especially, from someone who had been at OMB who went to another agency for a promotion, and Miles, who was in the Bureau of the Budget, said, just wait, in 6 months he will be as powerful a critic of OMB as he has been critical of the agency he was an examiner for. 6 months go by, and sure enough, that exactly happens. And Miles says, you know, the answer is where you stand depends on where you sit. And sure enough, in thinking about the positions that people take, it's useful to remember that fact for both career and political appointees. And if you appreciate that, it makes life a little more explainable. And also you learn to draw a distinction between the normal application of Miles' Law and the pathological cases of Miles' Law, when people become so blinded to their own immediate situation that they can't see a larger view. There is a difference. Third is sort of the golden rule is a pretty good rule. Do to other people the way you would want them to do to you. The be nice, maybe that's the be nice rule, but that puts maybe more of a point on it. The second is always good advice for people to keep up your networks. You never know when that's going to be useful, or folks will turn up in different roles. And since I mentioned General Semonite before, I'll use him as an example. I spent many years of my career in EPA in the Southeast region. General Semonite became the commander of the South Atlantic Division, and he and I got a chance to work together very closely on the Savannah Harbor project. So then I go off and retire, but then end up coming back and come up here. And General Semonite ends up as the commanding general for the Corps of Engineers. What a great connection. Those networks can be extraordinarily useful. All the structures of government are helpful, but the thing that gets things done is relationships. It really is all about relationships, and that's what networks can do for you. And finally, people always ask me, what should I do in transitions? And the number one piece of advice I give you is do your job well. Do your job well. In the long run, that pays off. So those are my when I do the summary description of things that are helpful in the course of transitions, it's a little cute to call them the top 12 tips, but those are the kind of insights I had from my experience.
Stan, your number one reminded me many years ago someone gave me a little box that was labeled The Secret of Success. And when you opened it, it said hard work. And that was it. Now that Stan's run through that, I'm going to ask the rest of you to comment on any of the ones that really resonate with you, or where you have some experience having seen that in action.
This is Rita, and first of all, I think these are excellent.
Thank you.
And I'd recommend that execs share them with their staff. These are good whether you're at an executive level or not. One that I particularly like is number 6. The glass is usually half full, although sometimes it's hard to see that. And I've worked for a very good boss in the past who is constantly telling us to assume positive intentions,
Yes.
which is very difficult. We get emails and, what are they thinking, and often we don't know if we can trust the people that we're dealing with and who have different positions than ours. But what my boss had encouraged us to do by assuming good intentions actually had as much of an impact on us as it did on other people. And it really affected, I think, outcomes and staying calm enough to look for those options and to also protect ourselves from risk. It was a very calming sort of thing.
Okay, any last thoughts from Carl?
Yeah, Carol, I think these are all great things, and I agree that these would really be good things to share with people because it's all just common sense. And as you know, the rule says is it's really not going to be as good or as bad as people think it might be. Everything tends to move towards the center. People will come in with a lot of great ideas, think they get things done. We help them understand what's in the realm of the possible, and then things sort of end up in the center. And as long as we don't take ourselves too seriously, as long as we act professionally, I think we're all going to get through this. The people who have trouble getting through it are the people who have difficulty dealing with change. And this is all about change. And it would have been changed no matter who won the election or how it went. There's always change. We just have to deal with it. So I appreciate that.
Carol, if I could just add a couple things. Rita, I thought that was interesting what you said about the I'm going to put it in my words, don't attribute to malice that which can be attributed to fill in the blank. And I think that does get you by on some days when you think, why, this is so personal. Well, it may not be personal at all, and it may be having to do with things that you just don't, that you have no way of knowing. And the other thing that I just wanted to comment on is one of the things that we've been working on at the National Academy of Public Administration is our own transition initiative. And we picked out 4 different areas of public administration. One was senior and human capital, strategic foresight, beyond the GPRA, chip shot in 4 years, but really looking around the corner, collaboration across government lines. But one of the things that I wanted to raise on this was the idea of not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. New administrations have the tendency to come in and want to throw out everything that was associated with the old, including nonpartisan good government initiatives. And we've seen that, it doesn't matter what the administration is, it's just natural. It's part of the DNA of a transition. And identifying those programs that aren't necessarily political but are actually good government and are working, I think can go a long way to help easing and making sure the transition is successful. And identifying those programs in a neutrally political way to allow the current administration to put their own imprimatur on it and make it their own. One of the things I think about is that evidence-based decision-making agenda. That it started with the GPRA process, it morphed at OMB with the PART, which was thrown out. Well, the PART had problems, but every program, there's nothing perfect. And it took the current administration about 4 years, 5 years, 6 years to kind of come around, and it's a big supporter of this evidence-based decision-making agenda. Moreover, there is this commission, the Commerce Department, through census funding, looking at all of this. And so I think this is something that I personally would hate to see thrown out. It doesn't have the mark necessarily. It was done under the Obama administration, but this isn't political. This is good governance. And identifying those things that are good governance that are working, allowing the new administration kind of that, maybe it's an out, to say, well, it was done then, but we're going to make it our own. And identifying those kinds of strategies, I think, will go a long way in assisting a transition.
And Dan, this is Stan. You're exactly right about that. And there's a certain amount of rebranding, as you say, that can go on. But the really sophisticated political executives figured this out. And Marianne Horenko, who I've done the panel that Carol mentioned with before, who was the Assistant Administrator for Solid Waste and Emergency Response in the second Bush administration, said exactly that about the brownfields initiative. She came in, saw that the work was going on. It was great work. Rebranded it, got Congress to pass a law authorizing it, and it was a big success story for the administration. But she knew, she had been in EPA before and knew to listen to good ideas from career staff and then make them her own.
Richard, anything you'd like to weigh in on?
Yeah, I really did like Stan's list. The one that I was going to note, I think, is particularly resonant now to me at the point where we are in transition. I really think that satisfying on small things does help build your credibility, and I think that's really true and insightful, because they ask for X. If you give them kumquat, that's not going to really help. If you give them X, not X prime, if you give them X, what they ask for, and you give it to them timely, high quality, I think you're really in a much longer term potential for success for them to give you other items. And I've worked for folks and with folks who understand that, oh, well, they asked for something different. No, actually, they asked for something, trying to help them out, try and give it a small piece in the front end, timely, speedy, good at analytic quality, and then that's going to help you down the line, especially if it's where they are. And if you can point out pitfalls, that's also helpful. But the key is the speed and the rest, even on small things, the front end really, really matters. So I think that's important for the credibility, because when you get to the next page about the 120-day rules, I think you want to have as many of those small wins as you can early on.
Well, thank you for that segue, Richard. So we'll go to the next one, the 120-day rule, which I put in because even though we did the SES rules during transition a month or so ago, it's worth reminding everyone that there is such a thing, and I know years ago in speaking to new SESers or folks in candidate development programs and getting blank stares, you realize a lot of folks come into the SES and aren't fully acquainted with all of the bits and pieces of the system. So the 120-day rule was created to provide an opportunity for the career executive and the political appointee to get to know one another. Now, that's the ideal situation. Granted, there are from time to time political appointees who come in who really don't have an interest in getting to know you, but that's unusual. It does happen, and in those cases you can get to the end of that period and not have had that opportunity, but I think the vast majority of the time you will. So there are 420-day moratoriums, and they are calendar days. So the first is with the beginning of a new administration, with the new president sworn in, there are no performance appraisals and ratings for 120 days. Second one is when the head of your department, and that is the department, not a component agency with the exception of DOD. So in DOD, it would be if you've got a new Secretary of the Army or Navy, this would apply. Otherwise, it would be with the new head of the EPA or Department of Commerce. But when that head is new, there are no involuntary reassignments or removals. If you're detailed, the first 60 days of the detail don't count toward the 120 days. However, an executive can waive his or her right, and that can happen for a variety of reasons. If there's a real need to move someone and they agree, which would make sense in that case. There's a business need to have you elsewhere. There have been other cases where it's not a real need, things just aren't working, and then the executive has to make the decision as to whether to waive the right, be cooperative, and move on and have a happier life. They can do that. third 120-day moratorium is when a new non-career appraising official is appointed, the person who has the authority to appraise you. There can be no involuntary reassignments. Again, with the exception that you can waive your right. And finally, when a new non-career immediate supervisor is appointed with authority to remove the career executive, there can be no removal for 120 days. So for anyone who needs more information or actually should take a look at the section of the Career Executives Handbook that's on the SES website, there is an entire section with much more detail about the 120-day rule and actually about what happens after 120 days on each of these topics. So, all right, I think we have come to the end, unless there are any final words from the panelists. If not, I will urge any of the non-members, well, I will first thank the members who have joined us for the webinar today for supporting SEA with their membership, and urge those who are not yet members to join and support SEA with their membership. And so I thank you all, and I hope that you have found this useful, and we look forward to a successful transition. Thank you.
Thanks, Carol.
Thanks, Carol.
Well, I want to thank you all for